He's representing the UNICA, which is a network of universities of capital cities. The second speaker will be Dr. Stefan Kuster, Acting Director of Science Europe, which is a Brussels-based association of 43 major European public research funding organizations and research performing organizations. The third speaker is Ms. Kathleen Mays, who is Chief Policy Officer for LIRU, which is the League of European Research Universities. And the fourth speaker is David Baumert, who is representing CESA, which is the Conference of European Schools for Advanced Engineering Education and Research. So may I invite Jacques first?
Yeah. Dear colleagues, thank you for inviting UNICA to join this conference on a very sensitive and difficult issue that is a crucial concern for all our universities. And I try to be a good train driver and catch up a little bit. So as you can see here, UNICA is a network of the University of Capital Cities, 46 universities in 35 capitals. And our main goal as the network is to support learning, sharing, and adding value within our members. I would just like to mention some levels of where we can contribute to this gender issue and gender equality issue in that regard. The first one, of course, is policy. And you can read in this mission statement on equal opportunities that to be member of UNICA network, to have to really involve yourself in this kind of issues and project. I won't read this. And I don't, of course, we would pretend that because of this, our members are developing policies and action plan regarding gender equity, but as a matter of fact, they do. And I think this highlights the high concern that it is and the involvement of the universities. Another core activity of UNICA are the networks. You can see all these networks in different domains, and these networks are grouping some of the members on very specific topics and work together and then disseminate among the members. And you can see that there is a working group on equal opportunity policy, including, of course, gender issues. I must admit that currently is not the most active group in the network, but still it exists. Then these networks can have a floor in our events. We have, as you can see, 20 events every year, more or less, including 4 Rectors seminars. And in these events, the working group and other members can address these issues and present the results of the working group. And sometime in the past, gender has been addressed. And we are also involved in some projects as UNICA, either coordinating the projects or involved in the project. And one is one that you know, Genovate, and which is trying to increase the number of women in and support the women in research in Europe. And I won't go into detail because you know this. Another one was RUMI, which was a project coordinated by UNICA with all the Moroccan universities. And in this project, the gender issue was also a concern and tackled during all these projects. So we can be part of these projects, support this project, and these projects, of course, involve all university members, and that we can do as a network, as UNICA. And last way that we can use to contribute is communication, of course. One is the news from UNICA, where we can disseminate or events or results from the project, so whatever happens, and also on kind of publications about the reports of the project and different material that we have to disseminate all the results and ideas and policies and sharing experiences. So, to sort of sum up, our main contributions to these issues as a network are the working groups, which are I think the most efficient tool that we have in the network to really put forward the question and work together and disseminate good practices. And there are some examples of this. Of course, as I mentioned, involvement in specific projects that can be developed, dissemination of the results through all kind of channels, and that's also a way to support the ongoing thinking about these issues, and also at the level of policy statement. And just a few comments to conclude about this, what I call lessons, but really into brackets, as you can see. What we could learn from these kind of topics and the project we were involved in, I would like to mention three main questions. The first one is that there is a need for what I call here multiple channels to address the issue. That is working group, that is major events, that is communication, that is all kind of tools that we can use, but we need diversity in the way we address these issues, because different people are attending different events or are more motivated by different kind of involvement. A critical role of working groups, because it's the place where really the people work, think really deeply to the issues and try to share experiences. But I have to say that we always have to keep in mind that it depends a lot on the people pulling the rope. And so these working groups are the half-life, as we say in chemistry, is not always very long. It could be just 4 or 5 years, because then the people change, the people go, and it's always difficult to reactivate the project. And the last thing I would like to mention that we could also observe is it's very important to regularly reactivate the issues, the questions, through, again, different channels, but it's never done for forever, and you know that this much more than I do. So these are the main comments I wanted to make as a network, which is always more or less in second line than in front line regarding these issues, but at least we can support some of the activities and policy statement to make the questions going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Next speaker will be Stefan Kuster from Science Europe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. I'll try to get through this in 8 minutes. That means I will speed through some slides and linger a little bit longer on the very important ones. The cover slide is not one of the very important ones. My name is Stefan Kuster, and I'm acting director of Science Europe, and this is Science Europe, this list of acronyms, which probably the ones in the back cannot read, but these are the large public research councils, research funding agencies, and research performing organizations in Europe, the non-university research performing organizations in Europe. You will probably recognize the few acronyms from your own country and maybe some of the others that are more recognizable. We have 43 of these members in Science Europe, and with them we work on things similar to what's already mentioned in the case of UNICA and that other stakeholder organizations do. We work on policy development, we work on collaboration among these members, and we are also a lobbyist for them. We advocate for science, for the role of science, in particular fundamental research in European legislation and policy making, but also for specific issues within science policy, and gender and diversity is one of them. It is actually one of our 9 main priority areas, and it's very important that it's not just gender. Of course, that's the one question that interests us today, but it's broader than that. It's gender and diversity in research. We've had an expert working group working on this, which has also been advised by a scientific committee that we have in place, which has produced several things, recommendations for our own governance, that's one of their tasks, but also recommendations to European institutions, to the European research area policy. We engage in dialogue with other stakeholders based on the expert input from our working group. But the main output of this group in the last 2 years, and that's what I'm here to present, that's this practical guide. This practical guide and copies of this are set up outside, and there's always an online version of this. And if you're interested in this, you can also order copies from our office. Just contact me. This is not a contribution to the evidence base or the knowledge base about the issue of gender imbalance in research. There is a lot of evidence, there is a lot of scholarly work on that, and it's great that there is, and there should be more, but this is not yet another contribution to that. It's also not yet another statement or policy declaration. There's also plenty of those, and it's important that we have those, but this is not another declaration about the issue and about the problem. This is a very simple attempt to list some of the simple practical things that are being put in place in the organizations in Science Europe that have proven to work to some degree. They are not, we don't claim that if you follow this guide, you will solve the problem, but these are small, inspiring examples from research councils and performing organizations across Europe that have helped to improve the situation in that particular context. They have to be understood in the legal national context in which they are used. But the hope of this guide is to serve other research organizations and people within them that are looking for solutions, because one thing is for sure, you're not the only one to have this problem. You're not the only university or funding agency or research council to have a problem of gender equality. The problem is persistent across countries. It's a global problem. It's persistent across disciplines. So this guide will be helpful, hopefully, for everyone looking for some inspiring examples of what works. It focuses on 3 areas, and all 3 of them have been mentioned in the past 2 days here. One of them is the issue of bias, and in particular unconscious bias in peer review panels and in different panels. The second one is how to effectively monitor gender equality. And the third one is, in a very practical sense, how to manage your grants and the support you provide to researchers in a way that it provides additional and special support to female researchers. To the first one, unconscious bias. So I'm not going to repeat everything that has been said about bias. There is a rich literature about bias. We know from the work we do with our organization that it appears in some very core processes that our organizations carry out. It appears in evaluation of the quality of science and of researchers for funding purposes, for recruitment purposes, for promotion purposes. We know that unconscious bias plays a role when you compare CVs. It plays a role when you write recommendation letters for female or for male researchers. It obviously plays a role in peer review panels that decide what researchers to fund or to recruit. So really it appears in the core business of most of our member organizations. So we had to address it in a practical matter. The first thing to do is to remove the "on" of the title unconscious bias, so to make it conscious, to know that you have a problem. And the only way and the best way to do that is look at the success rates of your peer review panels or your recruitment panels. There is no other reason than an internal bias if your success rates are different between men and women. I mean, obviously minor deviations, yes, but if you look at submission rates, they will be hugely different because they depend on the research pool, and they will show a problem upstream. But the success rates, if they are massively different, then your system in allocating funding or recruiting is biased. There's no other explanation to have major differences in success rates between women and male researchers. So first of all, look at those, and they will show you that you have a problem. So that's already one step in making the problem conscious rather than unconscious. Then discuss the issue within your organization. Discuss it, put it explicitly on the agenda of meetings, of board meetings, of your panel meetings, when you start a review process, for example, to allocate a specific grant, make sure you talk about this with these reviewers. And this is already part of awareness raising of point 3. Conduct awareness raising activities with your evaluation panels, with your decision-making bodies. Take half a day, a year, make a retreat, discuss about some strategic issues, and make sure this one is among those strategic issues you discuss with your boards and with your decision-making bodies and with your staff. The third one takes that even a little bit further, and that has also been mentioned several times, training. I mean, all of these are common sense, but when we look across our members and other research organizations, even though they are common sense, a lot of these things are not done on a regular basis. So these are not, we are not declaring that we have invented something massively revolutionary, but we're just listing some things that do work. So training definitely works. And then monitor whether your training works. That's an obvious step. And then the last one, here it says to learn from Science Europe members, but obviously you can learn from any organization that has found something that works and that has reduced the problem to some degree. So mutual learning, engage, and that's the value of these networks, of networks like LERU, like UNICA, like CESAR, and networks like yours, to engage in mutual learning. One thing is to preach to the converted, and we can all agree, yes, we have a big problem, we have to do something about it, but the other value of these networks is to learn from each other, and that's what this guide tries to do. These are just a few titles of good practice examples. The details of these, the rich description can be found in the guide of especially inspiring practices that some of our members have found to countering the unconscious bias issue. The Science Foundation of Ireland, for example, the major funder in Ireland, they have built it into their gender strategy to counteract the gender stereotype, and they know that this begins much earlier. This begins in school, so they have an outreach program to go to schools and talk about the issue with schools. CNRS, the French National Research System, they have a whole palette of awareness-raising activities. The Austrians, the FWF, they offer diversity training for each review panel before they start in reviewing proposals. The Swiss National Science Foundation, they have set up a small commission of international experts to advise them throughout the year on how to counter bias in their activities. The Swedish Research Council has observations. They have experts come to the sessions where they review proposals or recruitment and CVs, and these observers, they will then point out when you're basically making a leap or falling into a trap of bias. So these are just a few titles of examples of activities that funding agencies and research councils can have. The second aspect that is addressed in the guide is about monitoring. I said before that we have a lot of evidence. That is true. There is a lot of data out there. So these are a few recommendations about how to use the data effectively, a few simple indicators of all that mass of indicators that tell us that have a problem, which ones can be effectively used and measured because they're mostly already available. But before you do that, before you define your indicators, you should make sure that you have it in your strategy to have gender equality as a target, because only then you can know what you are measuring against. So some recommended indicators are, of course, you should measure the share of women and men among applicants. You should measure the share of women and men among successful applicants, so this will give you the success rate. And then a special one for funders, also try to measure the size of the grant. There are huge differences, even in successful candidates. Men tend to get more funding than women. Partly because men ask for more funding than women, but also probably due to some degree of bias in, she won't need all that. She won't need the $1 million that she's asking for. She can do with half of that. So that kind of bias. So you should also look at, always break it down by scientific field, by funding scheme, and by academic age, so years since PhD. That's the recommendation. Should also monitor the share of men and women among reviewers on your boards, even though evidence would suggest that even though completely female boards still are biased towards women candidates, but it's important to keep track of the share of women on your boards, on your decision-making bodies, and of course, the share of male and female in among your employees if you're a research performer. And again, always broken down by academic position, by scientific field, and very importantly, by the type of contract. Permanent contract versus part-time or temporary, full-time versus part-time. And the final item in the agenda, in the guide, is improving practices in the management of grants. So these are examples that are very richly described in the guide about supporting maternity leave, one of the big issues, providing obviously good practices to provide 100% salary during the leave. Funding organizations can provide a top-up to universities who would be too financially exposed if they had to cover the 100% salary themselves. There's support for paternity leave, so some funders provide support for fathers beyond the legal minimum required. No-cost extensions is widely used among funders, so this means you can extend the duration of your grant if you had to interrupt it due to maternity leave. And then very useful is part-time and flexible work options, working for a period of time, working part-time. Several funders offer this option. My last slide is how to use the guide. So this is really a very practical guide. It's a small example, so look for examples that you think are interesting. Then look which organization, there's a long index of which organizations use these examples, and then just contact them. Ask the people responsible for their gender strategy, how do you do it, what problems have you encountered? It includes a large list of grant management initiatives, and it includes a large reference list of current literature that you can look at. There is also some additional data presented online following that link, but I really recommend have a look at this guide. It's very simple and easy to use, and if you have any questions, contact us at Science Europe or contact some of the organizations listed here having these examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Our next speaker is Catherine Mays from the League of European Research Universities.
I was just saying to Stefan, I'm afraid I'm not that fast a talker, but I will try my best. Right. So another network, what are we? League of European Research Universities. It's an association of research-intensive, broad, comprehensive universities. We've existed since 2002. We have 23 members in 12 countries. We work across the spectrum of education, knowledge creation, research, and outreach to society, but we focus on research, and we are there mostly as a policy making, advocacy and lobby organization in Brussels, between quotation marks. You can see where our members are located on this map. So, as I said, we try to influence policy at the European Union and at the member state level. We do this through the various organizations and institutions that exist here in Brussels. You can see some of them listed there. We also work via our members to try and influence the member state level policy, so through prime ministers and researchers, using the channels, of course, that our universities have. That is important, but it's also important that we use the network for developing advocacy and policy. It wouldn't be possible if we didn't have the active involvement of our members, and that is good for mutual learning, for developing best practices or good practice, for institutional reflection, and so on. And I find those two functions of policy and mutual learning are really very important, and there's an interaction between the two. One wouldn't work without the other. Although we are a small group, and we are small because we try to influence, or we try to do those two previous functions very actively, we hope that we have a relevance for a lot of universities, not only in Europe, but also globally. And we do have links with other networks, similar networks around the world. So we have, as I said, our mutual learning is very important, and to that we have about 20 groups working on all kinds of issues and topics. They involve the senior leadership, academic leadership and management at the universities, from vice rectors to heads of HR, etc., etc. And we have had, since 2010 now, also a group working on gender. You can see some pictures there of our meetings. All our groups meet about twice a year, so you can calculate. We do lots of meetings, lots of travel. It's not only for us in the office, Liru office, 7 people, a lot of work, but also for our universities. I think one of the measures of the success of this network is the extent to which we ask and get engagement from the members in all our groups. It wouldn't work any other way. Actually, this group of the working group on gender, or thematic group it's now called, has existed since 2010, because I remember we had a meeting there with the then Commissioner, Mary Geoghegan-Quinn, and we went through our very nice spiel about who we are and what we do, and she said, "And what are you doing about gender?" And my leadership was a little bit quiet on that. So not very soon after that, we had a working group on gender. Hooray, Mary Geoghegan-Quinn. And it's been a very successful and active working group ever since. It has led to various papers. I'll talk about them in a little bit. I also want to say that thanks to those groups, we are able and we aim to also mainstream gender in our policy making. So when we are next coming out with our Framework 9 paper, June 20th, come to the launch here in Brussels, we consult with our gender group to make sure that what we are saying in that paper, we take into account the gender messages in there. Or when we, last year we did a paper on interdisciplinarity, there's a piece on gender in there as well. We are preparing a paper on research careers, mostly about, the large population of researchers that leave academia at some point, take up other jobs. We look at the issues for women in that as well. So that said, to say we try to mainstream our activities, in gender activities across the board. I think it's also important to say that in terms of the importance of networking, we have done some, we try to, even though our universities say, look, Liru is not a monitoring organization, right? We know how important data and figures and evidence are. So we've done some of that internally. That is not easy. I don't have time to go into it. It's actually quite difficult. But what is important also is that we are able to do it to some extent because people say, if it is for Liru, I can get these figures. Normally, it would be very hard to collect certain gender disaggregated data within the university. For some, not for others. But they say, if I can bring it to the working group gender, that's okay, I get them, And sometimes I have to say, but don't spread them, because we are, it's not that the data are sensitive, but what I also get is we need to deliver data for our national authorities, we need to deliver data for such an organization, and what they want sometimes is a little bit different. And then we have different figures being out in the open, and people start asking questions. Well, is it this or is it that? As you know, you can calculate data in many different ways, right? What is important is that you do something sensible with them. But anyway, that's just a little diatribe there. This group has been responsible for 2 major policy papers so far. In 2012, about the position of women at universities. And I won't go into the detail, you can read about it, but I think what is important on this is that we, as with all papers, the Rectors' Assembly, the 23 leaders of the university, have to sign off on all our papers. This paper is not an exception, they had to do that too. It took a lot of talking and discussion before they did, but we did get the commitment to say this is a high order, very important topic. And yes, we as universities, we are committed to do more than we are doing. Then 2 years ago, we also did a paper on gendered research and innovation, which is really about gender and sex analysis in the research content, in the research process. Again, I don't have time to go into it, but that was very important also in raising awareness about the issue. I was surprised talking to some of the senior leaders at the university how they were not aware of this issue. So we all know about the medical issues, but that it extends in other areas, and that was not so well known. Again, it's an open question. It's not something that you have to do, but you have to be open to ask the question. Of course, we are active with our gender activities at the European level. You can see Mary Gagan Quinn there signing a memorandum of understanding on advancing ERA, which was the original signing in 2012, and since then there's been the formation of the ERA stakeholders platform, and some of the organizations here are in that as well. We have those regular meetings. Those things, as has been said, are very important. Within the ERA stakeholders platform, there's also been a gender doers meeting, of which I have been part, and the others here as well. We have had several meetings to discuss and exchange policy practices and so on. Of course, we also try to weigh on what happens, so that is the Commission, on what happens within the Council. So when we knew that there were going to be Council conclusions in 2015, before they came out in September, we were there with our own statement. And actually, when looking at the draft conclusions, one of the things that we were unhappy with was the lack of attention to what we call GRI, the gender and sex analysis in the research content process. And so we made that possible through our statement to make sure that that was also paid attention to in the final Council conclusions in 2015. We do papers like an Era of Change was a briefing paper for the incoming Commission and legislation in Brussels in 2014. Again, as I said, gender mainstreaming, we make sure that we pay attention to gender issues in those kinds of briefing papers as well. So I'm almost at the end. I should say that we are also working now on unconscious bias. We have been in this working group for over a year. This is the way it goes in LIRU, lots and lots of talking, exchanging of practice. We are now starting to write things down. I'm hoping that early next year we have our policy paper ready. It will look at the evidence, because one of the things that we're seeing is, academics, we are all biased, and it takes some time to admit that. And one way you convince academics is with evidence. We show them the evidence, and there is lots of evidence. So this is what we are going to do in relation to what can universities do, should universities do, are they doing, not doing. We're taking a good look at ourselves, because things are far from perfect. It also makes some serious challenges, questions about meritocracy, right? We all like to hold up that word, and we're going to take an honest look at that. I'm out of time. I think I had prepared a couple of other discussion points. I don't know if we'll have time in a discussion session where I'd like to talk about the leaky pipeline versus the vanish box, meaning how do you attract, where do these women end up when they leak out of the pipeline, right? About open and transparent merit-based recruitment, about data monitoring, the metric tide. I've sort of hinted at it, that's sort of a little bit of an issue, and implicit bias. Not that you can get rid of it, but how to mitigate it, how to deal with it, raise awareness, training, and how do you do that training in order to mitigate it. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Our last speaker is David Beaumet from CESA, the Conference of European Schools for Advanced Engineering Education and Research.
Thank you very much. Also from my side, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much Evora, thank you, Gulsun, for this invitation to address such a brilliant audience on such an important topic as we are talking here today. The issue of persisting and serious gender imbalances in our faculty and management of universities is huge. And it is thus with a certain humbleness that I come here to report to you about the experiences in universities of science and technology in Europe. The Conference of European Schools for Advanced Engineering Education and Research unites 51 leading doctorate-granting universities of science and technology in Europe. From technical universities such as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Delft Technology University, as well as large comprehensive universities with a strong science and technology profile, such as Ghent University or Lund University. We have distinguished members in cities such as Trondheim, Tomsk, Istanbul, Haifa, Bucharest. As has been mentioned by my colleague from Science Europe and from LERU, we are also one of the ERA stakeholder organizations that back in 2012 have committed to achieve equal opportunities amongst our ranks. At the highest level within the association, it has been declared eine Chefsache repeatedly by our consecutive presidents and board of directors. In fact, our current president, Karl Lauber from TU Delft, himself has not only a proven track record within his own institution in achieving equal opportunities, but is also chairing the Task Force Human Resources, which is implementing our commitments along 3 steps. Step 1 was to understand what the actual situation was within the areas of STEM in general and science and technology more in particular. We thus carried out a large analysis amongst all our member institutions, facing comparable challenges like our colleagues from LERU to streamline data collections within our institutions, facing different expectations from our funders and from our governments. And in the end came forward with a report in 2015 comprehensively describing the state of affairs. It confirmed what one might have expected, with an increasing gender gap in universities of science and technology, from 35% females at the level of bachelors, dropping down to about 16% at the level of full professors, dropping to about 11% when it came to women presiding our member institutions. It was exactly that when step number 2 evolved, and the question this morning raised by Ursula Nellis, can systems learn from each other, emerged as the central question within our association. So in step number 2, the focus went onto the gender equality plans. Only about half of our institutions were actually having a gender equality plan. So in step number 2, we are currently through different workshops and conferences talking about the elements of gender equality plans, how to draft them, how to implement them, what works and what doesn't work. Interestingly, the issue raised by Seibold Noorda of the leadership training has evolved as one of the most important topics just recently in a workshop in Glasgow. Ladies and gentlemen, all of this is directed towards step number 3. Our board and our General Assembly recently have reconfirmed their commitment to achieve equal opportunities amongst our institutions. So the Task Force Human Resources and the entire constituency of our 51 universities is to embark on a journey towards what you might call the day of truth. In 2018, we will repeat the gender survey that we've carried out 4 years ago to see what the trends are, not only, but also to see to go more into depth, to look into the gender equality plans, to identify the best practices, and to define tools, concrete tools for our rectors, for our presidents to use. So in this sense, I think to me and to all of the board and the General Assembly, it is clear that rectors and presidents must assume strong leadership to achieve better equal opportunities within our institutions. Personally, and listening to the discussions this morning, I have the feeling it's more about dedicated sponsoring rather than mentoring. It's about decisive leadership training, recruitment, and promotion of careers of women in universities. So there's a clear and undisputed need for a rigid top-down approach stating best examples. However, and it has also been mentioned, not least by Leopold this morning and the other colleague on the gender dimension, there is a need to combine such a top-down approach with a bottom-up approach, effectively changing stereotypes and gender perceptions, not only in STEM, and in this sense, and there was a question earlier on this morning, we at CESAR, together with our members, are currently piloting and experimenting on a YouTube video campaign, changing perceptions, changing the attitudes towards science, technology, engineering, architecture, arts, and mathematics in videos of 1.5 minutes, therewith trying to address not least the gender dimension. In this sense, personally, but also as an association, we are very committed to work together with you, Gulsun and Evora, in the next years to come. Excited to look forward to end of 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you.